So guys, I'm going to be using my purple phone when talking about the black phone because I need a timer because I need to know when my camera is about to die because it only has so many minutes on it left. So anyway, let's talk about the black phone, directed by Scott Derrickson. Scott Derrickson has proven himself to be a very efficient horror director. He's given us such modern horror films as The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which was a very grounded, realistic take at an exorcism. He also gave us the supernatural thriller Sinister, which some horror fans complain was a little bit too ridiculous, but I found it incredibly eerie. Sinister actually really gets under my skin. He is an excellent director when it comes to building atmosphere. His films tend to be so atmospheric, and there's always a lingering sense of dread in the air. He took a little break from horror filmmaking to make Marvel Studios' Doctor Strange, which was a pretty decent Marvel film overall. But he has returned to the horror genre. He has returned to give us horror fans another presumably good title. This one is called The Black Phone. This is adapted from a short story written by Stephen King's son, Joe Hill. Joe Hill is also the man who wrote the novel Horns, which was adapted into a pretty decent-ish movie starring Daniel Radcliffe, aka Harry Potter. Daniel Radcliffe was quite horny in that movie. No more bad jokes like that, I promise. But The Black Phone. So, I have not read the short story, but I was really excited about it because, as I mentioned, Scott Derrickson is a very efficient horror director, and I was excited that he was returning to the genre. I really liked his previous two horror films. I haven't seen Deliver Us from Evil, but I haven't heard the greatest things. The Black Phone, when I saw the trailer, it looked like a throwback to 70s thrillers. You have this group of kids going up against this evil entity, in this case being the Grabber, played by Ethan Hawke. Although when I saw the trailer, I wasn't entirely sure if Ethan Hawke was going to be supernatural or not, or if he was going to be a very grounded, realistic serial killer. But watching the film, it turns out that, even though this film does have supernatural elements, Ethan Hawke's character, the Grabber, even though he has a very memorable design, he doesn't do anything that's special, at least in my opinion. There isn't really anything special about him as a horror antagonist, apart from the masks that he wears, which is actually really cool because his mask changes from scene to scene depending on what mood he's in. But what are my overall thoughts on The Black Phone? I thought it was a pretty decent thriller. This film is being marketed as a straight up horror flick, and the trailers make it seem as if it's going to be just a jump scare bonanza. There's only 2 jump scares that I can remember, and to be honest, they are incredibly well done. Scott Derrickson is very talented, when it comes to executing his scares. Oftentimes, you don't see the scares coming, and in this film, there are 2 jump scares that have absolutely no build-up whatsoever. They just come out of nowhere, but they still work, and they catch us completely off guard, and very, very well done. So the plot of The Black Phone basically involves these 2 young kids who are living with their abusive father. Apparently the mother is out of the picture, as is the case with a lot of, Stephen King stories. One of the parents has died, or one of the parents is an abusive alcoholic, which did worry me a bit at first, but we'll get into that. Anyway, these 2 kids, they have these very problematic lives. Their father is abusing them on a daily basis. The son is getting bullied at school. Kids are calling him some very offensive names. He doesn't have any friends apart from this one kid who is kind of feared at his local school because this kid is like, he's a bit of a fighter. He likes to, challenge kids to other fights. But news has broken out in this town. News of a serial killer called the Grabber, who has been kidnapping local children and doing unspeakable things with them. So what's interesting about this film is that it does take place in 1978, and it made me think of a lot of these nostalgia pieces that we've been getting these days. Some films and TV shows, they like to paint older decades in a very positive light, like films that are homages to the 80s. They'll show the 80s as a very positive time, when actually the 80s were full of terrible occurrences, and the 70s were no different. The town in this movie, it is just in utter fear of the serial killer. Parents everywhere are terrified that their kids are going to be abducted by the serial killer, and it doesn't paint the 1970s as a very positive time period. In fact, this movie will probably make you feel not very, but it'll probably make you feel somewhat depressed because, while there are, strong character moments and there's essentially a happy ending, the world of this movie is not a safe one. And I do respect it for that. And I just gotta say this, the two child actors in this movie are excellent. I can't remember the names off the top of my head, but the little girl in particular, she is amazing. And as I mentioned earlier, she is getting abused by her father, and there are sequences, when she's getting abused on screen, and it is eerily realistic. Her performance is just so raw and so realistic. Like, you genuinely feel sorry for her, and you feel sorry for her brother. And I like the relationship that these two have. They seem like actual siblings, which is why it's so heartbreaking when the son does eventually get kidnapped by the grabber.
Are those black balloons in there?
Would you like to see a magic trick?
I have an announcement to make. One of our students, Finney Blake, was abducted.
So the rest of the film, we follow the little boy as he's being kept in this dingy, underground basement. Ethan Hawke's character wants to play these mind games with him, but what happens is that this little boy gets these mysterious phone calls from this phone that is presumably, not working anymore. But he is being spoken to by these spirits, essentially, the spirits of these children who have all been murdered by the grabber, and they're basically giving him clues because they don't want him to end up like they did. And, honestly, while I did find this to be a pretty decent movie overall, some of the writing was a little bit contrived, especially the ending. I won't give anything away, but the ending, it was a little bit too coincidental for my taste, and you find out certain things about Ethan Hawke's character, and one element in particular makes him look like one of the dumbest serial killers in cinema history, at least when it comes to planning, which might be the point, but the reveal at the end was a bit silly. And yeah, I don't think any serial killer in their right mind, even though serial killers are obviously insane, I don't think they would do what Ethan Hawke does in this movie, when it comes to the bodies of his victims. Again, I won't give it away, but what really works about this movie is that, you are really rooting for this young boy to make it out alive. He's been put in this terrible situation, and he's a smart kid. He's using his environment to try to escape. He's using these rugs that he finds in the bathroom. He tries to feed this rope through this rug, and he's trying to get the window open. And if you look at this film more as like a survival tale than an all-out horror film, you might appreciate it a little bit more, because the audience I saw it with, I could tell, was getting a little bit antsy. Like, they thought it was going to be a bit more horrific. They were probably anticipating a few more jump scares, and this is much more of a psychological thriller. But if you look at it as more of like a survival movie, then you can probably appreciate it a lot more. So yeah, the audience, they were expecting more horror, and what they got was more thriller. But again, if you look at it as more of like a survival movie, if you look at this young kid and how terrible his life is, you want to see him, make it out of this terrible situation. And it becomes much more of a tale of survival than it does a tale of supernatural shenanigans, if that makes sense.
Doesn't work.
I'll scream. I'll scratch your face.
This face?
Scott Derrickson also brought back some familiar faces. He brings back James Ransone, and when James Ransone first showed up, I thought he was going to be, the comedic side character. I thought he was going to appear in one scene, and that was going to be his big appearance. But he does tie into the overall story, and he does have a purpose. So stick with it, because everything does come together in the end. The movie at first, for the first 20 minutes or so, it did feel a bit typical. Because in a lot of Stephen King stories, like I mentioned earlier, there are these noticeable tropes. You often have abusive parents who are either alcoholic or strictly religious. In this case, the father is a very heavy drinker, and he comes off as nothing but an abusive asshole at first, but he does have a bit of an arc. And by the end of the movie, you do start to side with him a bit more. He's not just a one-note character, which I did appreciate. The other story elements were a bit too familiar for my taste. I mean, you have the typical school bullies who pick on the main character for, seemingly no reason other than, he's different and he's a bit of an outcast. So, there are those tropes that I think, Joe Hill has become very accustomed to because, he's Stephen King's son. And, when he, as a person who grows up with a famous writer, I mean, I'm sure you become familiar with their tropes and their writing styles. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure Joe Hill has become a very fine writer, but I could still see some of his father's tropes in this movie. Although it was overall a very decent story. I mean, it was well told, the writing was solid, the performances all around were excellent. My biggest problem, there were some contrivances with the writing, particularly when it came to the ending. Ethan Hawke's antagonist wasn't particularly memorable, again, apart from his look. And by the way, I have to mention, I actually read this in an article. They brought back Tom Savini, yes, the great Tom Savini, to design Ethan Hawke's masks in this movie. I actually saw pictures of Tom Savini working on, the masks for this movie, and that is just so cool that they brought back Tom Savini for, contemporary horror film, because I can't remember the last time when Tom Savini worked on a mainstream Hollywood horror film like this. I mean, there might be some. I can't think of any off the top of my head. Or maybe he's worked on some TV shows recently. I can't, remember at the moment. But the look of The Grabber is very memorable. And props to Tom Savini. I mean, obviously he has blessed us with countless memorable special effects. And I'm just so glad that he, brought his A game to this movie, because the look of The Grabber is very memorable and fantastic. As far as the technical aspects of this movie, it was a pretty well shot movie. It was very saturated. There's not much color in this movie. I think Scott Derrickson wanted to make it look as if it was actually made in the 1970s, although he does tend to use shaky cam a lot, especially during action sequences, and that did get a little bit under my skin at times, particularly during this one chase sequence in the middle of the film. I thought there was just a little bit too much shaky cam to intensify, the action, and you guys know me, I'm not the biggest fan of shaky cam when it comes to action films, especially if the sequences also contain quick editing cuts. Those just tend to annoy me a little bit. Me personally, I wouldn't call it the best horror film of the year. For my money, Ty West's X still reigns supreme. I actually really appreciated X, released by A24 Film. I thought that film was just captivating in many regards. But The Black Phone is solid. It's a solid film. I'm glad Scott Derrickson decided to return to the horror genre. He gave us Doctor Strange. He explored blockbuster territory, but now he's back. Reminds me a bit of, when Sam Raimi did Drag Me to Hell after all the Spider-Man movies. He worked on these big Marvel blockbusters, but then he returned to his roots with 2009's Drag Me to Hell. So I like when directors break off into big budget filmmaking and then return to, the genres that gave them their start. James Wan did the same thing with last year's *Malignant*. James Wan made 2018's Aquaman, which was this big, explosive action blockbuster, but then he returned to *Malignant*, which was, a much, simpler film. But yes, I'm glad Scott Derrickson gave this movie, and I haven't read the short story that it's based on. From what I hear, it's pretty faithful, apart from, some changes made to the third act, which, like I said, I wasn't the biggest fan of the way the film wrapped up, even though it was a happy ending. I just thought it was a little bit too contrived, but there's so much to appreciate here, and the two child performances, the two child actors in this movie, I can't stress this enough. They give some of the best performances I have ever seen in a movie like this. They are incredible. I wish them nothing but long and happy careers. Seriously, you two were stupendous. That's all I can say, really. So guys, yes, go ahead and venture out to your local movie theater to watch 2022's The Black Phone. I really hope you enjoyed it. I like to rank things, so A24's X, I'd probably still put that at the top of the list as far as when it comes to this year's horror films. I also enjoyed 2022 Scream. You know, I thought that had some pretty decent moments. The Black Phone was, you know, a film that I enjoyed overall, so it'd probably be, you know, near the top, but definitely not above Ty West's X. Please check that film out. It didn't make a lot of money at the box office, but please give it some of your support. Give it some of your love. But yes, guys, I would love to know what your thoughts were of The Black Phone. Did you find it to be an excellent horror film? Did you find it to be a decent thriller? What were your overall thoughts on the film? Please let me know. I would love to read your comments. And, you know, as for me personally, this week, Stranger Things Volume 2 is finally coming out. I can't wait to see how they conclude the season. That was actually my last video. I talked about the first 7 episodes of Stranger Things Season 4. Please check that out as well. You know, I did some pretty cool video effects in that movie. You know, I inserted a filter that made it seem as if I was actually in the Upside Down. So I put a lot of hard work into that video. Please check it out, guys. But again, I love sharing my thoughts with, you know, fellow horror fans. You guys have been excellent. And if you liked this, go ahead and subscribe to our channel, Round the Clock Frights, for more horrific content. And boils and ghouls, no matter what you do, be aware of stranger danger. If a stranger approaches you in a black van, just please don't go anywhere near them, especially if, you know, they're A-list celebrities like Ethan Hawke. They might just try to grab you. Anyway, guys, you know, have a very scary night, boils and ghouls, and I hope you have an excellent rest of the summer. We got some big ones coming out pretty soon. I can't wait to see those. But yes, take care, guys, and stay scary as always, and sayonara. This is Joshua Essenberg signing off for the evening. I'm no Rod Serling, but I wish I was. Anyway, guys, have a good one. Take care.